The storm arrived without warning, as storms often do in the English countryside. Eleanor Hartley stood on the rooftop of Ashworth Manor, her thin dress plastered against her shivering frame, rain streaming down her face like tears she refused to shed. The wind howled around her, threatening to sweep her from the slick tiles, but she didn't move. She couldn't. Below her, the grand estate stretched in all directions, a monument to wealth she would never possess, to a life forever beyond her reach. She had come to Ashworth Manor 6 months ago, a governess hired to educate the Duke's young ward. Eleanor had been grateful for the position, desperate even. Her father's gambling debts had destroyed their family, leaving her mother dead from heartbreak, and Eleanor alone in a world that showed no mercy to fallen gentlewomen. The position had seemed like salvation, a chance to rebuild some semblance of dignity. But Ashworth Manor had proven to be a different kind of prison. The Duke of Ashworth was a man of reputation and power, his name whispered with reverence throughout the kingdom. At 32, Sebastian Blackwood had inherited his title young and built an empire of influence that extended to the palace itself. He was known for his sharp intellect, his impeccable taste, and his cold dismissal of anything that didn't serve his interests. Eleanor had seen him only a handful of times in her months at the manor. He was always traveling, always occupied with matters of state and business. When he was present, he moved through the halls like a distant monarch, barely acknowledging the servants who scrambled to serve him. But tonight, everything had changed. The Duke's sister, Lady Catherine, had arrived that morning with her venomous tongue and her cruel games. She had taken an immediate dislike to Eleanor, perhaps sensing in the young governess a breeding that belied her current station. At dinner, a meal Eleanor was required to attend to discuss her pupil's progress, Lady Catherine had orchestrated Eleanor's humiliation with surgical precision. "Tell me, Miss Hartley," Lady Catherine had said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "is it true your father died in debtor's prison? How perfectly tragic." The table had fallen silent. The other guests, London society at its finest, had turned to stare. "And yet here you are, dining at my brother's table. How generous of him to show such charity." Eleanor had felt the blood drain from her face. She had risen from her chair with what little dignity she could muster, and fled the room, their laughter following her up the stairs. She had run past her small chamber, past the servants' quarters, up the narrow stairs to the roof access that she had discovered during her lonely explorations of the manor, and there she had stood in the gathering storm, wondering if the fall would be quick. She wasn't suicidal, not truly, but she was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of enduring, tired of being reminded daily that she was nothing in a world that valued only titles and gold. The rain intensified, and Eleanor closed her eyes, letting it wash over her. She thought of her mother's gentle hands, of her father's laugh before the gambling consumed him, of the life that had been stolen piece by piece until nothing remained but this moment on a rooftop in a storm. Then she heard it, a voice cutting through the wind and rain, urgent and commanding. "Miss Hartley, Eleanor!" Her eyes flew open. Through the sheets of rain, she saw him, the Duke of Ashworth himself, emerging from the roof access, his fine evening clothes already soaked, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He moved toward her carefully, his boots sliding on the wet tiles. "Stay back," Eleanor called out, her voice breaking. "Your Grace, please, I will do no such thing," Sebastian said, his voice steady despite the storm. He continued forward, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "Whatever you're thinking, whatever drove you up here—" "You don't understand," Eleanor said, wrapping her arms around herself. "You couldn't possibly understand." "Then explain it to me." He was closer now, close enough that she could see the concern etched across his aristocratic features, an expression so unexpected it made her heart ache. "Tell me why you're standing on my roof in the middle of a storm, instead of safe inside where you belong." "Where I belong?" Eleanor laughed, a bitter sound that the wind carried away. "I don't belong here. I don't belong anywhere. Your sister made that abundantly clear tonight." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "My sister is a fool who confuses cruelty with wit. Her words mean nothing." "They mean everything." Eleanor's voice rose, years of suppressed pain breaking free. "They mean that no matter what I do, no matter how hard I try, I will always be the daughter of a debtor, the governess who dines above her station, the woman who—" Her words caught in her throat as her foot slipped on the wet tiles. In one fluid motion, Sebastian lunged forward, his arms closing around her waist, pulling her back from the edge. They fell together onto the roof, his body shielding hers as they slid down the slope, finally coming to rest against a chimney stack. For a moment neither moved, both breathing hard, the rain continuing its relentless assault. "Are you injured?" Sebastian asked. His voice rough with emotion he was clearly struggling to contain. Eleanor shook her head, unable to speak. She was pressed against his chest, his arms still around her, and she could feel his heart pounding as hard as her own. She had never been this close to him before, had never seen the gold flecks in his dark eyes or the scar that traced his left eyebrow. "Good," he said softly, "because if you had fallen, if you had been hurt." He stopped, seeming to catch himself. His expression shifted, becoming once again the cool, controlled mask she recognized. "Come, we need to get you inside before you catch your death." He helped her to her feet, his grip firm but gentle, and led her carefully back across the treacherous roof. Neither spoke as they descended the narrow stairs, water pooling behind them on the polished floors. It wasn't until they reached the hallway outside her chamber that Sebastian paused. "Miss Hartley," he said, his voice formal once more, though something unreadable flickered in his eyes. "What happened tonight at dinner, it was unacceptable. I will speak with my sister." "Please don't," Eleanor said quickly. "It will only make things worse." "It could hardly be worse if it drove you to stand on a roof in a storm." His tone was sharp, but she sensed the anger wasn't directed at her. "You will take tomorrow to recover. I'll inform the household that you're indisposed." Before Eleanor could respond, he turned and walked away, his wet boots squelching against the floor. She stood there, dripping and shivering, watching until he disappeared around the corner. Then she slipped into her small chamber and closed the door. As she changed into dry clothes, her hands trembling, Eleanor couldn't shake the memory of the Duke's face when he'd pulled her back from the edge, the fear she'd seen there, the raw concern that had broken through his aristocratic reserve. It made no sense. Why would a duke care if a governess lived or died? The question followed her into uneasy dreams, where storm and sky merged, and strong arms kept pulling her back from the abyss. The morning after the storm dawned clear and cold, as if nature itself was embarrassed by the previous night's dramatics. Eleanor woke late, her body aching from the ordeal on the roof, her mind clouded with memories she'd rather forget. She dressed slowly, expecting to find a letter of dismissal slipped under her door, but there was nothing. When she finally ventured downstairs to the schoolroom where she taught young Charlotte Ashworth, the Duke's orphaned cousin, she found the child absent and Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, waiting instead. "Miss Hartley," the older woman said, her usual stern expression softened by something that might have been sympathy. "His Grace has given instructions that you're to rest today. Young Charlotte has been taken to the village with her nurse." "That's very kind but unnecessary," Eleanor said, though relief flooded through her. She wasn't ready to face anyone yet. "I'm perfectly well." Mrs. Pemberton's sharp eyes assessed her. "Are you?" Because His Grace seemed quite concerned when he returned last night, soaked to the bone and demanding hot water be sent to your chamber. "He also—" She paused, as if debating whether to continue. "He dismissed Lady Catherine this morning, sent her back to London in his own carriage." Eleanor's heart stopped. "He what?" "Told her she was no longer welcome at Ashworth Manor until she learned basic human decency, from what I overheard." A small smile played at the corners of Mrs. Pemberton's mouth. "Caused quite the scene at breakfast. Lady Catherine wasn't pleased." "Oh God," Eleanor whispered, sinking into a chair. "He shouldn't have done that. His own sister. His Grace does what he believes is right, Miss Hartley. Always has." Mrs. Pemberton moved toward the door, then paused. "He's in his study if you wish to thank him. Or perhaps speak with him about last night." After she left, Eleanor sat in the empty schoolroom, her mind racing. The Duke had defended her, had sent away his own sister on her behalf. It made no sense. Men like Sebastian Blackwood didn't concern themselves with the feelings of their employees. They certainly didn't run through storms to save them. Unless— no. Eleanor crushed the thought before it could form. She couldn't afford foolish fantasies about a man so far above her station that they might as well exist in different worlds. Whatever had motivated the Duke's actions, it wasn't personal interest. It couldn't be. But as the day wore on, Eleanor found herself unable to settle. She walked the gardens, trying to lose herself in the late autumn beauty, but everywhere she looked reminded her of the previous night. The storm, the roof, the feeling of the Duke's arms around her. Finally, as afternoon shadows grew long, she made her way to the study. She knocked softly, her heart hammering. "Enter," came the Duke's voice, cool and measured. Eleanor opened the door and found him at his desk, surrounded by papers and correspondence, looking every inch the aristocrat she'd always believed him to be. He glanced up, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, pleasure, before his expression became neutral. "Miss Hartley, I trust you're recovered." "Yes, Your Grace, thank you." Eleanor remained near the door, suddenly unsure why she'd come. "I wanted to... that is, I heard about Lady Catherine. My sister needed to return to London." His tone was dismissive, but his eyes remained fixed on Eleanor's face. Her presence here was no longer appropriate. "Because of me." Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "Your Grace, you shouldn't have..." "I shouldn't have allowed her to humiliate a member of my household at my own table," Sebastian interrupted, setting down his pen. "That is what I shouldn't have done. Sending her away was merely correcting my own failure." Eleanor didn't know what to say to that. She'd expected indifference, perhaps annoyance at the disruption she'd caused, not this quiet acknowledgement of responsibility. Sebastian studied her for a long moment, then stood and moved around the desk. He stopped a respectful distance away, but Eleanor could feel the intensity of his gaze like a physical touch. "Miss Hartley, I must ask you something, and I require an honest answer." He paused. "Last night, when you went to the roof, was it your intention to..." "No," Eleanor said quickly, saving him from having to finish. "No, Your Grace, I wasn't. I just needed to escape, to feel something other than shame and anger. I didn't think about the danger until..." She stopped, her cheeks flushing. "Until you arrived." "I see." Some of the tension left his shoulders. "When Mrs. Pemberton told me you'd fled to the roof in the storm, He stopped himself, his jaw tightening. "It was irresponsible of me not to ensure you were properly defended against my sister's malice. I knew her nature, and did nothing to prevent what occurred." "Why did you come after me?" The question burst from Eleanor before she could stop it. "You could have sent servants, you could have left me there. Why did you run through the rain yourself?" Sebastian's dark eyes held hers, and for a moment Eleanor saw something in them that made her breath catch, something raw and unguarded that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. "Because," he said quietly, "the thought of you in danger was intolerable." The words hung between them, heavy with implications neither seemed ready to acknowledge. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, felt her heart begin to race in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the man standing before her. Before either could speak again, the door burst open. A young man Eleanor recognized as Lord Westley, one of the Duke's friends from London, strode in without ceremony. "Sebastian, I've just heard the most extraordinary news from..." He stopped, noticing Eleanor. "Oh, I apologize. I didn't realize you had company." The moment shattered like glass. Sebastian's expression closed, becoming once again the impassive mask of nobility. "Miss Hartley was just leaving. We were discussing her pupil's progress." The dismissal stung more than Eleanor wanted to admit. She curtsied quickly. "Thank you for your time, Your Grace. I'll return to my duties tomorrow." She fled before either man could respond, her chest tight with emotions she didn't want to name. Behind her she heard Lord Westley's amused voice. "Sebastian, old friend, since when do you interview governesses in your private study?" She didn't hear the Duke's response, and told herself she didn't want to. The following weeks passed in strange tension. The Duke had returned to his usual routine of business and travel, rarely present at the manor. But when he was there, Eleanor felt his gaze on her, across the dinner table when she was required to report on Charlotte's progress, in the hallways when their paths crossed by chance, through windows when she walked the gardens with her young charge. Charlotte had become attached to Eleanor, the 8-year-old girl blossoming under patient teaching and genuine affection. The child's parents had died in a carriage accident 2 years prior, and the Duke, as her guardian, had arranged for her care at Ashworth Manor, but his duties kept him distant, and Charlotte craved the warmth Eleanor provided. "Do you think Cousin Sebastian will come to my birthday celebration?" Charlotte asked one afternoon as they practiced her watercolors. "He promised, but he's always so busy." "I'm sure he'll try his best," Eleanor said, though she knew the Duke had been invited to a political gathering in London on the same date. "Your cousin cares for you very much. Then why is he never here?" The child's voice was small, wounded in the way only children can be when they feel abandoned by those they love. Eleanor had no answer that wouldn't be a lie. But 3 days later, everything changed. Eleanor was in the library searching for a book Charlotte had requested when she overheard voices from the adjoining room, the Duke's voice and another man's, both tense with argument. "You can't seriously be considering this, Ashworth," the stranger said. "Lady Victoria Pemberton? She's barely out of the schoolroom herself." "She's 20, Sebastian replied, his tone flat. "And the match is advantageous for both families." Her father controls half the shipping industry, and the alliance would secure your political ambitions," the man interrupted. "I understand the strategy, Sebastian, but marriage? You've avoided it successfully for a decade. Why now?" There was a long pause. Eleanor knew she should leave, should not be listening to this private conversation, but her feet wouldn't move. "Because it's time," Sebastian finally said. "I need an heir. I need to secure the line, and Lady Victoria is suitable." "Suitable? Good God, man, you sound like you're purchasing a horse." The stranger's voice softened. "Is this truly what you want? Because I've seen the way you look at—" "That's enough, Wesley." The Duke's voice was cold, final. "My personal feelings are irrelevant. The engagement will be announced within the month." Eleanor didn't remember how she got back to her chamber. She only knew that when she locked the door behind her, she was shaking, tears streaming down her face for reasons she refused to examine too closely. The Duke was getting married. Of course he was. Men like him always did. Advantageous matches that secured wealth and power, arrangements that had nothing to do with emotion or connection. Whatever had passed between them on that stormy night, whatever she'd imagined she'd seen in his eyes, it meant nothing, because she was nothing. A governess. A fallen woman from a disgraced family, and he was a duke who had his duty to fulfill. That night, Eleanor made a decision. She would find another position, somewhere far from Ashworth Manor, and the impossible feelings that had taken root in her heart. She would leave before the engagement was announced, before she had to watch the Duke pledge himself to another woman while she stood invisible among the servants. But before she could act on her resolution, Charlotte fell ill. A severe fever that had the doctor summoned urgently, that had the household in an uproar, that had the Duke, who had been in London, racing home through the night. Eleanor sat at the child's bedside, bathing her burning forehead with cool cloths, whispering stories and prayers into the darkness. When Sebastian arrived at dawn, still in his travelling clothes, his face drawn with worry, he found Eleanor there, exhausted but vigilant. "How is she?" he asked, his voice rough. "The fever hasn't broken yet, but the doctor believes she'll recover." Eleanor stood, swaying slightly from fatigue. "I'll leave you with her, Your Grace." "No." His hand caught her wrist, gentle but firm. "Stay, please. She'll want to see you when she wakes." So Eleanor stayed, and together they kept vigil over the sleeping child. As morning light crept through the curtains, Charlotte's fever finally broke. She opened her eyes, saw the Duke beside her, and smiled weakly. "You came," she whispered. "Of course I came," Sebastian said, his voice thick with emotion. "Did you think I wouldn't? You're always so far away," Charlotte murmured, already drifting back to sleep. "But Miss Eleanor is always here. She never leaves." The words struck like a blade. Sebastian's eyes met Eleanor's across the bed, and in them she saw a mirror of her own pain, the recognition of impossible situations, of duties that couldn't be abandoned, of feelings that couldn't be acknowledged. "Your Grace," Eleanor said softly, "about your engagement. You heard that. It wasn't a question. I did, and I think it's time for me to seek a new position. For Charlotte's sake, it would be better if—" "Don't." The word was almost a command. Sebastian stood, moving around the bed with predatory grace. "Don't leave. Charlotte needs you. The manor needs you. He stopped, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Miss Hartley, Eleanor, you must understand that—" But whatever he meant to say was interrupted by the arrival of the doctor, come to check on his patient. The moment shattered once again, and Eleanor fled before her resolve could crumble entirely. She didn't know that the Duke stood at Charlotte's window long after she'd gone, watching her walk through the gardens below, his expression one of profound conflict. She didn't know that later that day, he would write a letter to Lady Victoria's father, requesting more time before making the engagement official. She didn't know that the impossible was already beginning to seem, in the privacy of his own heart, somehow necessary. All Eleanor knew was that she was falling in love with a man she could never have, and that the fall would destroy her far more certainly than any storm ever could. 3 weeks passed in careful avoidance. Eleanor threw herself into Charlotte's education and recovery, staying close to the schoolroom and her chamber, taking meals separately from the household. The Duke had returned to London, and Eleanor told herself it was relief she felt, not disappointment. But on a grey November afternoon everything changed. Mrs. Pemberton came to the schoolroom, her face pale and drawn. "Miss Hartley, a gentleman has arrived to see you. He's waiting in the front parlour." Eleanor's stomach dropped. No one knew where she was except for the employment agency, that had placed her at Ashworth Manor. Did he give his name? Mr. Edmund Hartley. Mrs. Pemberton's expression was carefully neutral. He claims to be your cousin. The room seemed to tilt. Edmund, her father's nephew, a man she hadn't seen since childhood, someone she'd hoped never to encounter again. What could possibly bring him to Ashworth Manor? Eleanor found him in the parlour, a thin man with sharp features and calculating eyes, dressed in clothes that were expensive but slightly worn, the look of someone trying to maintain appearances beyond their means. Eleanor, he smiled, showing too many teeth. How delightful to find you here, and in such prestigious circumstances. What do you want, Edmund? Eleanor kept her voice level, her hands clasped tightly before her. Is that any way to greet family? He moved around the room, appraising the furnishings with an expert eye. I've been searching for you for months. Your disappearance after your mother's death was quite concerning. I was escaping creditors, your father among them. Edmund's smile didn't waver. Yes, about that. My father passed away 6 months ago, God rest his soul. And in going through his papers, I discovered something rather interesting. He withdrew a folded document from his coat. It seems your father, before his unfortunate demise, transferred certain properties to my father's care. Properties that, upon my father's death, should rightfully pass to you as the only surviving member of the direct Hartley line. Eleanor's heart began to pound. That's impossible. My father had nothing left. Everything was sold or seized. Not everything. Edmund's eyes glittered. There's a small estate in Suffolk. Nothing grand, but respectable. Worth perhaps £2,000 per year. My father kept it quiet, thought to claim it himself, but the legal documents are quite clear. It's yours, cousin. You're not penniless after all. The news should have been joyful, life-changing. Instead, Eleanor felt only dread as she watched Edmund's expression, waiting for the trap to spring. Of course, Edmund continued, his voice taking on a silky quality. There are certain complications. You're unmarried, without male protection. The courts could tie the inheritance up for years, especially with your father's debts still outstanding. You'd need someone to vouch for you, to manage the legal proceedings. Someone like a husband, perhaps. There it was. Eleanor took a step back. No, don't be hasty, cousin. I'm prepared to help you. To marry you, in fact. As your husband, I could secure your inheritance, manage the estate, ensure you're properly provided for. We'd both benefit from such an arrangement. You want my inheritance. Eleanor's voice was flat. You thought to keep it for yourself, but the documents are too clear. So instead you'll marry me and control it that way. I prefer to think of it as a mutually beneficial partnership. Edmund moved closer, his smile fading. But here's what you need to understand, Eleanor. If you refuse me, I'll make sure those legal complications I mentioned become very real. I have friends in certain offices, connections your little governor's salary could never afford to fight. You'll spend years in court, waste what little money you have on solicitors, and likely end up with nothing, or... His smile returned. You could be sensible. Marry me, secure your future, and stop playing at being a servant in someone else's home. Eleanor felt sick. She knew men like Edmund, had watched her father fall prey to such creatures. Get out. You have 1 week to consider, Edmund said, unperturbed. I'm staying at the inn in the village. After that, I begin the legal proceedings to contest the inheritance. And Eleanor, he paused at the door, don't think about hiding again. I'll find you, and next time, I won't be so generous with my offer. After he left, Eleanor stood in the parlour, trembling with fury and fear. An inheritance. Money of her own, independence she'd never dreamed of having again, and all of it threatened by a man who saw her as nothing more than a means to wealth. She couldn't think clearly, couldn't breathe in the suddenly stifling room. She fled to the gardens, then beyond, walking until she reached the estate's boundary, where ancient oak trees marked the edge of Ashworth land. That's where Sebastian found her an hour later. Mrs. Pemberton said you had a visitor. He approached cautiously as if sensing her fragile state. She seemed concerned. Eleanor didn't turn around. My cousin, come to inform me that I'm not quite as penniless as I thought. She heard the surprise in his voice. That should be good news. Should be. Eleanor laughed bitterly. Except he wants to marry me to control the inheritance. And if I refuse, he'll make sure I never see a penny of it. Silence fell between them, broken only by the wind in the bare branches above. Then Eleanor felt Sebastian's presence behind her, close but not touching. What will you do? His voice was quiet, careful. I don't know. Eleanor closed her eyes. If I had the money, I could leave service, could live independently. But fighting Edmund in court would cost everything I have, and marrying him, she shuddered. I'd rather remain a governess forever than tie myself to a man like that. There might be another way. Sebastian's words were measured, as if he was testing each one before speaking. If you were under the protection of someone Edmund couldn't threaten, someone whose legal resources he couldn't match. Eleanor turned to face him, her heart suddenly pounding. Your Grace, I couldn't ask you to... You're not asking, I'm offering. Sebastian's dark eyes held hers with an intensity that stole her breath. Eleanor, I've tried to do the honorable thing. I've tried to maintain proper distance, to remember my duty and your position. But watching you suffer, knowing you might be forced into a marriage with a man who would use you, his hands clenched at his sides, I can't stand by and allow it. What are you saying? Eleanor whispered. I'm saying that if you were engaged to me, your cousin would have no claim. My solicitors could handle the inheritance, ensure everything was transferred to you properly. You'd be protected. Eleanor's mind reeled. A false engagement. Your Grace, the scandal, if it were discovered. Not false. Sebastian stepped closer, his voice dropping to something raw and honest. Eleanor, don't you understand? I've been trying to marry Lady Victoria because it was logical, because it was expected, because marrying you seemed impossible. But I can't do it. Every time I try to imagine a life with her, all I see is you on that roof in the storm, you sitting at Charlotte's bedside, you walking through my gardens as if you belong there. Because you do. You belong here, at Ashworth Manor, with Charlotte who loves you and with me who... He stopped, seeming to struggle with words that had never come easily to him. Eleanor waited, barely breathing, as something fundamental shifted between them. Who loves you? Sebastian finished quietly. I love you, Eleanor Hartley. I have since the moment I pulled you back from that edge and realized that losing you would break something in me that could never be repaired. I know it's impossible. I know society will condemn it, that my family will be horrified, that marrying a governess will damage my standing in ways that matter to people who... He stopped, his expression fierce. None of it matters as much as you do. Marry me. Not for the inheritance, not for protection, but because the thought of a future without you in it is unbearable. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. She had imagined this moment in secret, shameful dreams she'd never admitted even to herself. And now it was real and terrifying and everything she'd ever wanted. The scandal will destroy you, she whispered. Your political ambitions, your standing in society. Let it. Sebastian's hands came up to frame her face, his touch gentle despite the intensity in his eyes. I've spent my entire life doing what was expected, what was proper, what would advance the Ashworth name, and in all that time, I've never felt more alive than I did running through the rain to reach you. Marry me, Eleanor. Choose this impossible, scandalous thing with me. Yes. The word broke from her on a sob. Yes, I'll marry you. Sebastian pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were something precious and fragile he'd been afraid of breaking. Eleanor clung to him, feeling the solid reality of his embrace, the steady beat of his heart against hers. Then he was kissing her, and nothing else mattered. Not Edmund, not society, not the impossible obstacles that surely lay ahead. There was only this moment, this man, this choice that felt like both a fall and a flight. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Sebastian smiled, a true smile that transformed his usually austere features into something young and almost boyish. I should probably ask properly, he said, with a ring and bending knee and... You ran through a storm for me, Eleanor interrupted, laughing through her tears. I think that's quite romantic enough. But as they walked back to the manor hand in hand, Eleanor couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. Edmund wouldn't accept this easily. And the society that Sebastian was so willing to defy would be a far more dangerous enemy than any cousin could be. The real battle, she suspected, was just beginning. They found the household in chaos. Mrs. Pemberton met them at the door, her face grave. Your Grace, a letter came while you were out. From London. It's marked urgent. Sebastian took the letter, his expression darkening as he read. Then he looked at Eleanor, and she saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. What is it? She asked. It's from the Queen's secretary. I've been summoned to court specifically regarding rumors that I've formed an inappropriate attachment to a member of my household staff. Sebastian's jaw tightened. Someone informed the palace. Someone who wants to ensure that any marriage between us would carry the Queen's official disapproval. Edmund, Eleanor breathed. He must have sent word when he left here. If we marry against the Queen's wishes, I could lose my title, my lands, my place at court. Sebastian's voice was flat, but his hand tightened around Eleanor's. "Everything that makes me who I am." Eleanor pulled away from him, her heart shattering even as she forced the words out. "Then we can't marry. I won't let you sacrifice everything for the woman I love." Sebastian's eyes blazed. "Eleanor, I don't care about the title if it means losing you." "But I care," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. "I care because Charlotte needs you as the Duke, because your tenants depend on you, because throwing away everything your family built for centuries is not a sacrifice I can accept. Your Grace—" "Sebastian," he interrupted. "Please, at least call me Sebastian." "Sebastian." His name felt like a prayer and a goodbye. "We have to find another way, some way that doesn't destroy you." "There is no other way," Sebastian said. "Not one that ends with you in my arms where you belong." But Eleanor saw in his eyes that he knew she was right. Love, no matter how fierce, couldn't erase centuries of tradition, couldn't override a queen's command, couldn't make the impossible suddenly possible, unless they found a way to make it so. The next morning, Sebastian left for London to face the Queen's summons, leaving Eleanor behind at Ashworth Manor with instructions to stay hidden until his return. But Eleanor had never been one to wait passively while others decided her fate. She spent 2 days in the library, reading through dusty law books and historical documents, searching for some precedent, some loophole that might allow their marriage without destroying Sebastian's position. Mrs. Pemberton, sensing the urgency, helped her, bringing meals and fresh candles as Eleanor worked late into the night. On the 3rd day, she found it. Buried in an obscure statute from the reign of Charles II was a provision allowing peers to contract marriages considered beneath their station, provided they could demonstrate that the match brought some exceptional benefit to the crown or kingdom. The cases were rare: a duke who married a merchant's daughter whose trading connections secured crucial wartime supplies, an earl who wed a foreign-born woman whose family's diplomatic ties prevented a conflict. The precedent was thin, but it existed. Eleanor's heart raced as she copied out the relevant passages. If they could prove that their marriage served some greater purpose, if they could show the Queen that Eleanor brought value beyond her breeding. But what value? Eleanor stared at the papers, her hope fading as quickly as it had risen. She was nobody, a governess from a disgraced family. What could she possibly offer that would justify a duke abandoning traditional marriage expectations? The answer came from an unexpected source. Charlotte, recovered from her illness but subdued by Sebastian's absence, had taken to spending evenings with Eleanor in the library. On the 4th night, the child asked quietly, "Is Cousin Sebastian in trouble because of us?" "Not because of you, sweetheart," Eleanor said gently. "It's complicated, adult matters." "But it is about you," Charlotte persisted with the clear logic of children. "The servants whisper. They say Cousin Sebastian wants to marry you, and the Queen is angry." She looked up at Eleanor with solemn eyes. "Are you going to leave like Mama and Papa did?" Eleanor's heart broke. She pulled Charlotte into her arms. "No, darling. I promise I won't abandon you." "Then you should marry Cousin Sebastian," Charlotte said simply. "He needs someone who won't leave, and so do I." The word struck Eleanor like lightning. Charlotte had been orphaned, left in the care of a distant cousin who, despite his love for her, was often absent due to his duties. The child needed stability, needed a proper family, needed a mother, and Eleanor could give her that. More importantly, she could give Sebastian that, could help him create the family he'd been avoiding, because duty had demanded a political match rather than a personal one. It wasn't much. It wouldn't sway a queen or silence society's condemnation, but it was something, a foundation to build on. Eleanor was still forming this fragile plan when Sebastian returned 5 days after his departure. She heard the commotion of his arrival and rushed to the entrance hall, then stopped short. He looked exhausted, his face drawn and pale, his movements lacking their usual grace. When his eyes found Eleanor, something in them made her breath catch. Not defeat exactly, but a weariness that went bone deep. "Your study," he said quietly. "Please." They walked in silence through the manor, servants scattering before them. Once the study door closed, Sebastian moved to the window, standing with his back to Eleanor, his shoulders rigid with tension. "The Queen has made her position clear," he said, his voice flat. "Any marriage between us would be viewed as a scandal that reflects poorly on the crown and the nobility it represents. If I proceed, I'll be stripped of my position at court, excluded from political life, and face significant social censure. The Ashworth name, which my family has maintained unblemished for 3 centuries, would be tainted by association with—" He stopped, his hands clenching on the windowsill. With what she called my unfortunate infatuation with a servant. Eleanor felt each word like a physical blow. Then it's impossible. She also made an offer. Sebastian turned to face her, and Eleanor saw something fierce burning in his eyes despite his exhaustion. Lady Victoria's father has significant influence over several members of Parliament, whose votes I need for a reform bill I've been championing, a bill that would improve working conditions in factories, provide protections for child labourers. The Queen suggested that marrying Lady Victoria would ensure those votes and position me as a champion of progressive causes. She painted it as my duty to the people who depend on noble advocacy for change. She's manipulating you, Eleanor said, anger rising, using your conscience as a weapon. Of course she is, but that doesn't make the need any less real. Sebastian moved toward Eleanor, stopping just out of reach. The Queen gave me 2 weeks to decide. Marry Lady Victoria and secure my political future, and the reforms that could change thousands of lives. Or marry you and become a social pariah who can help no one. The silence stretched between them, heavy with impossible choices. There's something else, Sebastian said quietly. Edmund has filed a challenge to your inheritance. He's claiming that your father's debts must be settled before any property can be transferred, and that you lack the legal standing to contest it without a male guardian or husband. My solicitors could fight it, but it would take months, possibly years, and cost everything I don't have, Eleanor finished. She sank into a chair, feeling the trap closing completely. Without the inheritance, she had nothing, but claiming it required marrying Edmund or finding another protector. Hans Sebastian, the only man who could help her, would destroy himself if he did. This is my fault, Eleanor said. If I'd never come to Ashworth Manor, if I'd never stood on that roof, if you hadn't, I'd have married Lady Victoria without a second thought and spent the rest of my life pretending I was content. Sebastian knelt before her, taking her hands in his. Eleanor, these past weeks, knowing what it feels like to love someone, to be loved in return, I can't regret it. Even if we can't have a future together, I can't regret knowing what it means to choose something for myself instead of duty. But you should choose duty, Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. Those factory workers, those children, they need the reforms you can achieve. I won't let you sacrifice that for personal happiness. I won't let you abandon people who have no voice because you... Her voice broke. Because you fell in love with the wrong woman. Sebastian's expression crumbled. Don't ask me to give you up. Don't ask me to stand at an altar with another woman when you're the only one I want beside me. I'm not asking. I'm telling you that I could never be happy knowing our love cost children their chance at better lives. Eleanor cupped his face, memorizing every feature through her tears. You're a good man, Sebastian Blackwood. You're exactly the kind of noble the world needs. And that's why I have to let you go. No. Sebastian pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. There has to be another way, some solution we haven't seen yet. Eleanor wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe. But as they held each other in that study, both knowing their time was running out, she couldn't imagine what miracle could save them. The next week was agony. Sebastian refused to accept defeat, spending hours with his solicitors, searching for legal precedents, writing letters to potential allies. Eleanor tried to help, but Edmund's machinations had been thorough. The inheritance challenge was carefully constructed, exploiting every weakness in Eleanor's position. And then 6 days before Sebastian's deadline, a letter arrived that changed everything. Eleanor was in the schoolroom with Charlotte when Mrs. Pemberton brought it. Miss Hartley, this came for you from Suffolk. The letter bore the seal of Hartley Estate, Eleanor's supposed inheritance. With trembling hands, she opened it and read, Miss Hartley, I served your grandfather for 40 years as his estate manager, and your father after him until his troubles began. I have recently learned of Mr. Edmund Hartley's claims regarding the estate. I feel compelled to inform you that Mr. Edmund is misrepresenting the situation significantly. Your father did not transfer the estate to Edmund's father. He entrusted it to my management, with instructions to maintain it until you came of age or married. The property generates not £2,000 yearly, as Edmund claimed, but nearly 4,000, thanks to investments your grandfather made in the railway expansion. Additionally, there are securities and bonds your father protected from creditors by transferring them into a trust in your name, a trust Edmund has no knowledge of. You are, Miss Hartley, considerably more than not penniless. You are in fact quite wealthy, and you have been since your father's death, though the trust couldn't be accessed until you reached 25 or married. I would be honored to meet with you and your solicitors to arrange proper transfer of all holdings. Edmund Hartley has no claim beyond his own greed. Your servant, Thomas Wickham Eleanor, read the letter 3 times, her heart pounding. Not just an inheritance, but wealth. Enough wealth to be independent, to have standing, to be something more than a desperate governess. Enough wealth that marrying a duke might be scandalous, but not quite the disaster the Queen imagined. She was still staring at the letter when Sebastian found her. She thrust the paper at him without preamble. Read this. She watched his face as he read, saw understanding dawn, saw the same fragile hope she felt, beginning to grow in his expression. This changes things, he said slowly. Not everything. Society will still condemn the match and the Queen will still be displeased. But if you're a woman of property with substantial holdings, I'm still not nobility, Eleanor interrupted. Still the daughter of a debtor who died in disgrace. No, you're the granddaughter of a respected gentleman, the daughter of a man who protected his family's wealth even in his darkest hour, and a woman who has earned her own position through intelligence and grace. Sebastian's eyes blazed with renewed determination. Eleanor, this might be enough. If we can demonstrate that you bring financial stability to the marriage, that Charlotte has flourished under your care, that the match serves the Ashworth family's interests, the Queen won't care, Eleanor said, though she wanted desperately to believe otherwise. Perhaps not, but others might. Sebastian was already moving toward his desk, pulling out paper. Lord Wesley has the Queen's ear on personal matters, and there are other voices, other influences. If we can build enough support, present the marriage as beneficial rather than scandalous. Sebastian, Eleanor's voice stopped him. Even if this works, even if we can somehow convince society to accept us, you'll still lose the votes you need for your reforms. Lady Victoria's father will withdraw his support. Sebastian set down his pen and came to stand before her. Then I'll find other votes. I'll build new alliances. I'll work twice as hard for half the influence if that's what it takes. He took her hands, his grip firm and sure. Eleanor, I've been trying to be practical, to weigh the costs and benefits like marriage is a business transaction, but the truth is simpler than that. I love you, I choose you. Whatever consequences follow, we'll face them together. Eleanor felt the last of her resistance crumble. She'd been trying to be noble, to sacrifice their happiness for the greater good. But Sebastian was right. Love wasn't a calculation. It was a choice, a leap, an act of faith that the world might somehow shift to accommodate it. Then we fight, she said. We fight for this impossible thing and pray that the world has enough room for a love like ours. Sebastian kissed her then, soft and reverent, a promise sealed with touch. When they pulled apart, both were smiling despite the battle still ahead. There's one person we should tell first, Eleanor said, someone who deserves to know what we're trying to build. They found Charlotte in the gardens, painting watercolors with more enthusiasm than skill. When they told her their plans, the child's face lit up with a joy so pure it made Eleanor's eyes sting with tears. So, Miss Eleanor would be my cousin too? Charlotte asked. And live here forever? If the world allows it, Sebastian said, pulling the girl into an embrace. We're going to try very hard to make that happen. Charlotte looked between them with the solemn wisdom of someone who had lost too much too young. Then the world better allow it, because Miss Eleanor promised not to leave me, and Cousin Sebastian always keeps his promises. So you have to marry each other. It's logic. Eleanor laughed, the sound breaking through the tension that had gripped her heart for weeks. Is that logic? The very best kind, Sebastian agreed, his arm around Eleanor's waist. His future, their future, finally beginning to feel possible rather than impossible. But neither of them saw Edmund Hartley watching from the tree line, his expression twisted with fury, already composing the letter that would bring their fragile hope crashing down. Sebastian and Eleanor's renewed determination lasted exactly 3 days before Edmund struck. They were in Sebastian's study, meeting with Mr. Wickham, who had travelled from Suffolk to confirm the inheritance details, when Mrs. Pemberton entered with an ashen face. Your Grace, there are visitors, several members of the Peerage Council, accompanied by representatives from the Queen's household. They're demanding an immediate audience. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. The Peerage Council only involved themselves in matters of scandal or disgrace, serious enough to threaten the nobility's reputation. Their presence at Ashworth Manor could only mean one thing. Edmund had made his final move. Sebastian stood, his expression hardening into the aristocratic mask Eleanor had come to recognize as his armor against the world. Show them to the drawing room. Miss Hartley, you should— I'm staying, Eleanor interrupted. Whatever Edmund has done, whatever they've been told, I'm not hiding. Sebastian's eyes met hers, and she saw both pride and fear in their depths. Very well. Together then. The drawing room held 5 men, all wearing expressions ranging from stern disapproval to barely concealed disgust. Lord Pemberton, the council's chairman, stood at their centre, a document in his hands. Your Grace, he said without preamble, we have received serious allegations regarding your conduct and that of Miss Eleanor Hartley, currently employed as your ward's governess. Given the gravity of these claims, we felt immediate investigation was warranted. What claims? Sebastian's voice was cold, controlled. Lord Pemberton glanced at Eleanor with barely concealed contempt before reading, that you have engaged in an inappropriate and scandalous relationship with an employee, that you have promised marriage to said employee despite her unsuitability and against the express wishes of Her Majesty, that Miss Hartley has used manipulation and feminine wiles to ensnare you, targeting your wealth and position for her own advancement, and— he paused, his mouth tightening— that Miss Hartley is not who she claims to be, but is in fact the daughter of a debtor who died in prison after attempting to defraud numerous gentlemen, including members of this very council. The accusations hung in the air like poison. Eleanor felt her face burning, felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but no words would come. These allegations are false, Sebastian said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Or rather, they are deliberate distortions designed to— Are you denying that you intend to marry Miss Hartley? Lord Pemberton interrupted. The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor saw Sebastian's jaw tighten, saw him weighing his words. If he lied now, they might leave, but the lie would poison everything they'd been trying to build. I do not deny it, Sebastian said clearly. I intend to marry Miss Hartley, with or without the council's approval. Gasps echoed through the room. Lord Pemberton's expression turned thunderous. Then you admit to behavior unbecoming a peer of the realm. Your Grace, surely you understand the consequences. I understand that love is being treated as a crime, Sebastian interrupted, his voice rising. I understand that you've been sent here by a vindictive man who sees my intended bride as nothing more than a means to wealth. And I understand that this council has no legal authority to prevent me from marrying whom I choose. We have the authority to recommend to Her Majesty that your title be reviewed, Lord Pemberton said coldly. We have the authority to exclude you from court, to ensure that no gentleman of quality will receive you. We have the authority to make your life, and that of any woman foolish enough to marry you, a living nightmare of social exile. Then do it, Sebastian said, and Eleanor heard in his voice the absolute certainty of a man who had made his choice and would not be swayed. Strip my title, exile me from court, condemn me to social death. I will still marry Eleanor Hartley, because she is worth more than all of your approval combined. The words struck Eleanor like a physical blow, not because they hurt, but because they revealed the magnitude of what Sebastian was willing to sacrifice. Her duke, who had spent his life building influence and respect, was ready to throw it all away for her. No, Eleanor said, her voice quiet but firm. All eyes turned to her. She stepped forward, placing herself between Sebastian and the council. No, Your Grace, I won't let you do this. Eleanor, Sebastian began, but she cut him off. Gentlemen, she addressed the council, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. You accuse me of manipulation and deception. You paint me as a scheming woman who trapped a duke, but the truth is simpler and more human than your accusations allow. She took a breath, feeling Sebastian's presence behind her like a wall of strength. I came to Ashworth Manor as a governess because I had nowhere else to go. My father's debts had destroyed my family, and I was alone in the world. The Duke showed me kindness when I expected none. He saved my life when I stood on a roof in a storm, not knowing if I wanted to come down. And yes, he fell in love with me as I fell in love with him, not because of manipulation, but because love doesn't follow your rules or respect your boundaries. It simply is. Lord Pemberton's expression remained cold. A pretty speech, Miss Hartley, but it changes nothing. Your background— My background includes an inheritance of £4,000 per year and substantial securities, Eleanor interrupted, drawing strength from the shock on their faces. I am not the penniless fortune hunter you've been led to believe. My father, despite his troubles, protected his family's wealth through legal trusts. I have independent means, and require nothing from the Duke except his love. Nevertheless, Lord Pemberton said, though his voice had lost some of its certainty, your father died in disgrace. The daughter of a debtor cannot marry into one of England's most prestigious families without tarnishing. Then every family in this room is tarnished, a new voice interrupted from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Lord Wesley stride into the room, documents in hand, his expression thunderous. Behind him came 3 other gentlemen Eleanor recognized from court, powerful men whose opinions carried weight. Lord Wesley, Lord Pemberton said stiffly, this is a private council matter. Not anymore. Wesley moved to stand beside Sebastian and Eleanor. Because I've just come from reviewing records at Somerset House. Tell me, Lord Pemberton, does your family's fortune not stem from your great-grandfather's shipping business? A business built on profits from ventures that included smuggling and slave trading. Shall we discuss the tarnish on your family name? Lord Pemberton's face reddened. That was a different era. Standards were different. How convenient. Wesley turned to another council member. Lord Hertford, your grandfather married a French actress. The scandal nearly destroyed him. Yet here you stand, respectable and titled, judging others for their choices in marriage. This is outrageous, Lord Hertford sputtered. What's outrageous? Said one of the men who had entered with Wesley, the Duke of Thornbury. Is this council presuming to dictate matters of the heart? Ashworth is one of the most respected voices in Parliament. His reforms have helped thousands. And you would destroy him because he chose love over political convenience? Her Majesty, Lord Pemberton began, has been given incomplete information. Another of Wesley's companions said smoothly, this was Lord Chancellor Beaumont, one of the Queen's most trusted advisers. I've already sent word correcting the misunderstandings. Her Majesty has no official position on the Duke of Ashworth's private matrimonial choices, provided they don't damage the Crown's interests, which, given Miss Hartley's substantial independent wealth and the Duke's continued commitment to his parliamentary duties, they do not. Eleanor felt the room shift, felt the balance of power tipping away from the Council's condemnation. But Lord Pemberton wasn't finished. Even if Her Majesty doesn't object, society will never accept this match. The Duke will be excluded from every respectable home. His voice in Parliament will be ignored. He'll be a pariah. Then society needs to evolve, Sebastian said, his hand finding Eleanor's and gripping it tightly. Because I'm marrying Miss Hartley, and any gentleman who wishes to exclude me for choosing love over tradition is welcome to do so. I'll build new alliances with people who value character over bloodlines. You're a fool, Ashworth, Lord Pemberton said bitterly. Perhaps, Sebastian agreed. But I'm a fool who will wake every morning beside the woman he loves, knowing he chose his own happiness over your approval. Can you say the same? The question hung in the air unanswered. Lord Pemberton gathered his papers with sharp, angry movements. The Council will note its disapproval of this match. Whether Her Majesty chooses to act on our recommendation is beyond our control. But mark me, Ashworth, this decision will follow you for the rest of your life. I'm counting on it, Sebastian said quietly. The Council members filed out, their disapproval palpable. Only after the last had gone did Eleanor allow herself to breathe fully. She turned to Lord Wesley and his companions, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know what you did, how you convinced them. We did nothing but present facts, Wesley said with a slight smile, and perhaps remind certain parties that glass houses and stone throwing rarely end well. Ashworth has allies, Miss Hartley, more than he realizes. Many of us have been hoping for years that he would stop being so damn noble and choose something for himself. The Duke of Thornbury nodded. The reforms you've championed have made enemies of the traditional old guard Ashworth, but they've also won you friends among those of us who believe the nobility must evolve or perish. Your marriage to Miss Hartley, it's actually rather perfect. A statement that character matters more than birth. It will still be difficult, Lord Chancellor Beaumont warned. There will be gossip, some social exclusion, but the worst is over, and in time, as your marriage proves itself, society will adjust. It always does. After they left, Sebastian pulled Eleanor into his arms, holding her as if he'd never let go. I thought we'd lost, he murmured against her hair. When that council walked in, I thought, I know, Eleanor said. I thought the same. Sebastian, are you certain? Even with their support, this won't be easy. People will talk, will judge. Let them, Sebastian said fiercely. Eleanor, I've spent my entire life caring what people thought, and in one moment on a roof in a storm I learned that none of it matters as much as you do. I choose you, now and always. Eleanor pulled back to look at him, memorizing the fierce love in his eyes. Then I choose you too. Whatever comes, we face it together. They sealed the promise with a kiss, unaware that outside the door Charlotte was dancing with Mrs. Pemberton, both of them wiping away happy tears, unaware that in the village Edmund Hartley was packing his belongings, his schemes in ruins, his claim to the inheritance demolished by Mr. Wickham's evidence, unaware that across England, in drawing rooms and clubs, the story of the Duke who defied society for love was already spreading, and that far more people found it romantic than scandalous. But they did know in that moment that they had won. Not completely, not without cost, but enough to build a life together, to create the family Charlotte desperately needed, to prove that love could exist even in a world governed by rules and restrictions. That night Sebastian proposed properly, with his grandmother's ring and a formal speech that made Eleanor laugh through her tears. Charlotte insisted on being present, declared it the most romantic thing she'd ever witnessed, and immediately began planning the wedding with the single-minded determination of an 8-year-old who had decided her favorite adults belonged together. And far away in London, in the Queen's private chambers, Her Majesty read Lord Chancellor Beaumont's revised report and allowed herself a small smile. The young Duke of Ashworth had always been too serious, too bound by duty. Perhaps a love match with a woman of character would remind him that nobility meant more than bloodlines and tradition. She picked up her pen and wrote a brief note. Her Majesty extends her congratulations to the Duke of Ashworth on his forthcoming marriage and looks forward to meeting the new Duchess at court. It wasn't an enthusiastic endorsement, but it was permission, and sometimes that was all love needed to survive. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the chapel at Ashworth Manor, a small affair attended by those who truly mattered. Charlotte served as Eleanor's attendant, her face glowing with joy. Lord Wesley stood as Sebastian's witness, his usual irreverence replaced by genuine happiness for his friend. Eleanor wore a gown of ivory silk that Mrs. Pemberton had spent weeks altering from Sebastian's mother's wedding dress, a gesture that had moved Eleanor to tears when the housekeeper presented it. "Are your family now?" Mrs. Pemberton had said gruffly. "Might as well look the part." As Eleanor walked down the aisle, she saw Sebastian waiting at the altar, and everything else fell away. The whispers from society, the struggles still ahead, the uncertainty of their future. None of it mattered when compared to the look in his eyes as she approached. The vicar spoke the traditional words, but Eleanor barely heard them. She was too focused on Sebastian's hands holding hers, on the promises they were making, not just to each other but to themselves, to choose love over convention, passion over propriety, the impossible over the expected. When the ceremony concluded, and they were pronounced husband and wife, Sebastian kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. The small gathering erupted in applause, Charlotte's enthusiasm loudest of all. The wedding breakfast was joyful and intimate. Lord Wesley gave a toast that walked the line between heartfelt and scandalous, making everyone laugh. The Duke of Thornbury spoke of courage and change, of how the nobility would only survive if it learned to value character as much as lineage. Even Mr. Wickham had travelled from Suffolk to attend, presenting Eleanor with the full accounting of her inheritance, wealth that would ensure she and Sebastian could weather any financial consequences of their controversial marriage. But the most touching moment came from Charlotte, who stood on her chair and declared in her clear child's voice, "I'm glad Cousin Sebastian married Miss Eleanor, because now I have a proper family again, and that's what everyone deserves, a family that chooses to love them." Eleanor caught Sebastian's eye across the table, saw the emotion shimmering there, and knew they had made the right choice. Not the easy one, not the socially acceptable one, but the true one. The weeks following the wedding brought challenges, as Lord Chancellor Beaumont had predicted. Several of London's most prestigious hostesses declined to receive the new Duchess of Ashworth. Invitations to certain balls and gatherings mysteriously failed to arrive. Eleanor overheard snide comments at the modiste's shop and saw women turn away in the park, but for every door that closed, another opened. Younger members of the nobility, tired of their parents' rigid rules, sought out the Ashworths' company. Eleanor found herself becoming something unexpected, a symbol of change, proof that the old hierarchies could be challenged. Women wrote to her, sharing their own stories of thwarted love and impossible choices, thanking her for showing that alternatives existed. Sebastian's political work continued, though some allies did distance themselves as predicted. But he built new coalitions, found support among progressive lords who valued his reforms over his scandalous marriage. The The factory protection bill he'd fought for passed 6 months after the wedding, not with Lady Victoria's father's votes, but with support from merchants and industrialists who saw the economic value in treating workers fairly. "You did it," Eleanor said the night the bill passed, watching Sebastian read the final tally. "You changed lives, helped people, all while defying society's expectations." "We did it," Sebastian corrected, pulling her into his lap. "I couldn't have found the courage without you. You showed me that some rules exist to be broken, that character matters more than compliance." Eleanor kissed him softly. "And you showed me that love doesn't have to be reasonable to be real." Charlotte flourished under their care, blooming into a confident girl who painted with abandon and asked questions that made even Sebastian pause to think. She never again felt abandoned or alone, secure in the knowledge that her unconventional family would always choose her. The inheritance Edmund had tried to steal became Eleanor's tool for change. She used the income to fund schools for girls from impoverished backgrounds, ensuring that other women wouldn't face the same desperate choices she had. She established a fund to help families struggling with debt, breaking cycles that destroyed lives and families. Sebastian supported every endeavor, proud of the woman who had transformed from a desperate governess on a roof into a duchess who used her position to lift others. Edmund himself disappeared into obscurity, his reputation destroyed by the revelation of his schemes. The last Eleanor heard, he'd left England entirely, seeking opportunities in America where his name carried no weight. She felt no triumph at his downfall, only relief that he could no longer hurt anyone she loved. A year after the wedding, Eleanor stood in the gardens of Ashworth Manor, her hand resting on her rounded belly where their child grew. Sebastian approached from behind, wrapping his arms around her, his hand joining hers over their unborn baby. "Having second thoughts?" he teased gently. "Missing your quiet life as a governess?" Eleanor laughed, leaning back against his chest. "Every day. The scandal, the gossip, the weight of a title, and now morning sickness. Whatever was I thinking?" "You were thinking," Sebastian said, his voice growing serious, "that love was worth fighting for. That impossible things become possible when people refuse to accept the limitations placed on them. Is that what I was thinking?" Eleanor turned in his arms to face him. "I thought I was just trying not to fall off a roof." "You've been falling ever since," Sebastian said, his eyes warm. "We both have, falling into this life we've built, into the family we've created, into a future that looks nothing like what anyone expected, and everything like what we needed." Eleanor kissed him, pouring into the gesture all the love and gratitude she couldn't express in words. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "Do you think they'll ever fully accept us?" Eleanor asked, not because she needed reassurance, but out of genuine curiosity about how their story would end. "Some will, some won't," Sebastian said, with the pragmatism she'd come to love. "But our child won't grow up in a household governed by others' expectations. They'll know they were born from love that refused to be constrained by rules. And perhaps that's the legacy that matters, not acceptance, but the courage to choose happiness over approval." As if in agreement, Charlotte came running through the gardens, her painting supplies forgotten, calling for them to come see the new foal in the stable. They followed her hand in hand, the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth, scandalous, happy, and utterly content in the impossible life they'd fought so hard to build. Behind them, the manor stood solid and enduring, its walls having witnessed 3 centuries of Ashworth history. But now those walls held something new, proof that even the most rigid traditions could bend, that love could flourish in unexpected places, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was run through a storm to reach someone standing on the edge. 5 years after Eleanor stood on a roof in a storm, Ashworth Manor had become something remarkable, not just an estate, but a symbol of what happened when courage met compassion, when love challenged tradition and emerged victorious. Eleanor sat in the morning room, now decorated with Charlotte's paintings alongside works by established artists. The girl had developed genuine talent, encouraged by tutors Sebastian had hired, despite the traditional view that artistic pursuits were frivolous for young ladies. At 13, Charlotte's watercolors were being shown in small galleries, her work praised for its emotional honesty and technical skill. Their son James toddled across the carpet, pursued by his younger sister Anne, both of them shrieking with laughter. Eleanor watched them with a contentment she'd never imagined possible during those dark days when she'd been nothing more than a desperate governess with nowhere to go. "Mama, tell James to give back my doll," Anne demanded, her dark eyes, so like her father's, flashing with indignation. "James, darling, we don't take things from our sister," Eleanor said gently, though she was smiling. At 3, James had his father's commanding presence, but his mother's mischievous spirit, a combination that promised interesting years ahead. Sebastian entered the room, dressed for London, though his expression showed his reluctance to leave. The carriage is ready, but I'm reconsidering this entire journey. Why exactly did I agree to address Parliament today? Because you're the leading voice for education reform, and 50 members are waiting to hear your proposal for universal primary schooling, Eleanor said, standing to adjust his cravat. Also because you never back down from a fight, especially one that matters. He caught her hands, holding them against his chest. I'd rather stay here. James has been asking about horses, and Anne wants a story. And you... His eyes grew heated. You look particularly beautiful this morning, Your Grace. Flattery won't excuse you from your duties, Eleanor said, though she blushed. After 5 years of marriage, Sebastian could still make her heart race with a look. Go change the world. We'll be here when you return. Promise? The question was light, but Eleanor heard the echo of old fears, of the night he'd run through a storm, terrified of what he might find. Promise, she said firmly, kissing him. I'm not going anywhere. We're not going anywhere. This is home, Sebastian, forever. After he left, Eleanor gathered the children for lessons, Charlotte joining them to help with Anne's letters. The schoolroom had been transformed from the sparse chamber where Eleanor had first taught into a bright space filled with books, maps, and scientific instruments. Sebastian had spared no expense on education, believing that knowledge was the greatest gift they could give their children. Mama, Charlotte asked during a break, do you ever think about how strange it is that everything changed because of a storm? Eleanor considered the question. Not strange, miraculous perhaps, or simply proof that life can shift in a moment, that courage shows up when we need it most. Papa says you were the brave one, Charlotte said, standing on that roof, refusing to give up even when everything seemed impossible. Your father is biased, Eleanor said with a smile. But the truth is we were both brave. He ran through the storm and I let him save me. Sometimes courage is knowing when to accept help. That evening, after the children were in bed, Eleanor walked the manor's halls, pausing at portraits that now included her own. The scandal of the Duke who married his governess had faded into romantic legend. Young couples cited the Ashworths as proof that love could overcome social barriers. Novelists wrote thinly veiled stories about their courtship. And slowly, grudgingly, society had adjusted. They weren't invited everywhere. Some doors remained permanently closed. But enough had opened that Eleanor now hosted salons attended by artists, writers, and progressive thinkers who cared more about ideas than pedigree. The Duchess of Ashworth had carved out her own place in society, one built on character rather than compliance. She found herself in Sebastian's study, running her fingers over the books and papers that represented his life's work. The reform bills he'd championed had changed thousands of lives. Children worked fewer hours in safer conditions. Women had new legal protections. Education was becoming accessible to classes long excluded from learning. I thought I'd find you here. Sebastian's voice came from the doorway. Parliament adjourned early, the proposal passed initial review. Eleanor turned, joy flooding through her. Sebastian, that's wonderful. He crossed the room, pulling her into his arms. It's happening, Eleanor. Everything we've fought for, it's becoming real. In a generation, England will be a different place. Children like you were, facing their father's debts with no options, will have education and opportunities. The world is changing. Because of you, Eleanor said. Because you refuse to let tradition dictate morality. Because of us, Sebastian corrected. You taught me that some rules deserve to be broken, that love is stronger than law, that choosing happiness isn't selfish, it's revolutionary. They stood together in the quiet study, the manor settling around them, and Eleanor felt the weight of their journey, from that desperate night on a roof to this moment of triumph and peace. Do you ever regret it? She asked softly. The scandal, the social consequences, the doors that never reopened. Sebastian pulled back to look at her, his eyes holding the same fierce love she'd seen on their wedding day. Not for a single moment. You and Charlotte and our children, you're my legacy, Eleanor. Not my title, not my reforms, but this family we've built from impossible choices and stubborn hope. That's very romantic for a duke, Eleanor teased, though her eyes were wet with tears. I learned from the best, Sebastian said, kissing her softly, from a woman who stood on a roof in a storm and showed me what courage really means. Later, as they prepared for bed, Eleanor stood at the window overlooking the gardens. Moonlight silvered the landscape, and she could just see the roof where everything had changed. where she'd stood on the edge, not knowing if she wanted to come down, and where a duke had run through the rain to reach her. "What are you thinking about?" Sebastian asked, joining her at the window. "About storms," Eleanor said. "About how sometimes they destroy, but sometimes they clear the air, wash away the old, make room for something new to grow." "Profound thoughts for bedtime," Sebastian said, his arm around her waist. "I'm a duchess now," Eleanor said with mock dignity. "I'm supposed to have profound thoughts." "You're my Eleanor," Sebastian corrected. "Profound, brave, impossible Eleanor, who changed everything by refusing to accept that love had to follow rules." She turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had run through a storm for her, who had chosen her over tradition, who loved her with a fierceness that still took her breath away. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For seeing me when I was invisible, for choosing me when it was impossible, for building this life with me, storm by storm, choice by choice." Sebastian kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I would run through 1,000 storms for you, Eleanor Blackwood. Every single time, I would choose you." And in the morning, when sunlight streamed through the windows and their children's laughter echoed through the halls, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that some loves were worth every scandal, every sacrifice, every impossible choice, because she had stood on a roof in a storm and a duke had run through the rain to reach her. And from that single moment of courage, his and hers, an entire world had been born, a world where love mattered more than propriety, where character outweighed breeding, where two people who should never have found each other had built something beautiful and lasting and true, a world that 5 years later felt less like a miracle and more like home. Before you go, tap the like button and subscribe for new stories every week.